The court's arena was absolute chaos. Tens of thousands of people were screeching my name, while the host looked like he might burst an artery right into his microphone. He announced that Boruto's 9 tails had bitten the dust, declaring me the champion of this year's Indigo League. My solo Annihilate had just swept his entire team without sweating through a single strand of fur. Fans were screaming in the stands. Some proclaimed their eternal love, while others joked that they could have taken second place since they get trampled every day anyway. They raved about me being a legendary prodigy and the ultimate pride of Kanto. I simply stood on the pitch, yawned like a lazy cat on a warm afternoon, and kept my hands buried deep in my pockets. The audience took my blasé attitude as the swagger of a true prodigy. In reality, I was just bored out of my mind. I looked over at my final opponent, who was sobbing in a pathetic little ball on the ground. Defeating a third-rate trainer with fourth-rate Pokémon felt like taking candy from a sleeping Togepi. The whole tournament was basically a glorifying baby cup for stomping beginners. Winning the Indigo League wasn't anything to write home about. It certainly didn't make me the Kanto champion. Once the ceremony wrapped up, I packed my bags and headed home, ready to pivot back to my real job. My destination was Viridian City, the land of eternal greenery and floral perfection. Out of all the gym leaders in Kanto, my father was by far the most popular. The local lineup was a total circus. Pewter and Cerulean were undergoing midlife crises. Vermilion's leader had no chill. Saffron was basically haunted. Celadon's boss was permanently asleep, and Cinnabar's safety record was a joke. Amidst that parade of oddballs, my dad, Giovanni, shone like a polished diamond. He was smooth, wildly talented, and even wrote a best-selling book on ground-type strategies. The public worshipped him as Kanto's premier leader, oblivious to who he actually was behind closed doors. I waltzed straight into his private office and collapsed onto the leather sofa like an exhausted sack of potatoes. I demanded a massage, whining that the journey had drained all my energy. Dad sat at his desk, chuckling quietly at my usual laziness, while his secretary, Matori, walked over to rub my shoulders. Dad asked how it felt to conquer the court's conference. I sniffed and admitted that the entire roster was a massive letdown. Matori agreed in her usual icy tone, though her eyes softened as she looked at me. Dad chuckled again, reminding me that I was simply operating on a completely different level than those rookies. He was right. Dad had raised me to be a prodigy, and I even inherited the blessing of the Viridian Forest just like him. He fully expected me to eclipse his legacy one day, especially after the incident that made him spoil me rotten. Of course, as I grew up, I developed a few unique habits. Last year, Dad left me in charge of the gym while he attended to some private rocket business. When he returned that evening, he walked up to his office door only to hear some very suspicious, intimate noises coming from inside between his secretary and his son. Dad later told me his mind went utterly blank, like a stampede of toros had flattened his brain. Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of conflicting emotions, he quietly retreated to the bathroom and lit a cigarette for the first time in years. He chose to stay silent, sacrificing his dignity out of pure fatherly love. Sadly for him, that hilarious little scandal was only the beginning of my chaotic journey. In my book, living a life without embarking on random odysseys is like a dish left entirely without salt. My father, who practically worships the ground I walk on, saw absolutely no flaw in this philosophy. Recognizing that plotting world domination behind closed doors has its creative limits, he graciously escorted me out of town himself. Fast forward about 5 months into my legendary travels, and a rather amusing scene unfolded back at our gym. A adorable, fair-skinned girl named Mizuki wandered in, looking as innocent as a freshly hatched Togepi. She timidly informed my dad that I had personally dispatched her to his doorstep to study under his wing until she was old enough to travel. When my father pressed her on our exact relationship, she blushed furiously and innocently dropped a bombshell, mentioning that I told her she could stay and give birth right there if she happened to end up pregnant. That single sentence completely shattered the legendary composure of Giovanni, the undisputed mastermind of the underground. The dark ruler of Kanto region Hap, de Mo Bang Dukin Ben Dezem Them Thong Tin, was utterly frozen, left silently questioning his entire life choices. Reliving that golden memory, Dad massaged his throbbing temples as he looked at me, sitting across the table with my feet kicked up like a king enjoying a royal spa day. He probably missed the cute, porcelain doll version of me from 10 years ago. Shaking off his headache, he asked what my grand master plan was next, having always respected my autonomy without forcing a set path upon me. I gestured for Matori to pause the shoulder massage, leaned forward, and asked Dad how he viewed our syndicate's current standing in the region. He quietly sipped his tea and told me to get straight to the point. I reframed the question, asking if our organization had truly hit a ceiling in this territory. Matori chimed in, adjusting her glasses and wondering if I was suggesting an expansion into neighboring lands. She reminded us that Dad had already deployed our top elite commanders to the nearby capital district. I casually waved off that effort, pointing out that seizing those neighboring areas was a guaranteed cakewalk anyway. However, hoarding local resources still wouldn't give us enough firepower to crush the league's top 4 champions and their terrifying arsenal. Instead of picking a bloody, exhausting fight on home turf, I proposed keeping our local operations running smoothly while exporting our brand of villainy across the globe. When Matori voiced concerns about clashing with rival syndicates overseas, I burst out laughing at the sheer absurdity of comparing us to those amateur-hour crews. I laid out the global playing field with brutal honesty. The oceanic factions in Hoenn are just delusional environmentalists fighting over mud and water. The galactic outfit in Sinnoh consists of unhinged zealots wanting to erase reality itself. Unova's local squad lacks any real bite. Kalos is run by fashion-obsessed maniacs, and Alola's resident troublemakers are basically a glorified street gang. As for Galar and Paldea, they don't even have a competent underground syndicate to speak of, meaning we would glide through their territories like a Gyarados in a bathtub. Dad took a slow sip of his tea, thoroughly entertained by my breakdown, and asked with a knowing smirk which region I wanted to conquer first. I spun a giant map onto the table and flashed a predatory grin at Matori, asking her which prime piece of real estate we should conquer first. My father's secretary froze like a clueless Psyduck. As a cautious pencil pusher, she hesitated, but she quickly shifted her mental gears to play along with our grand blueprint. She nervously suggested target markets like Galar or Paldea, reasoning that the complete absence of local criminal syndicates left the playing field wide open. I crossed my legs, leaned back, and gently popped her naive bubble. I explained that Galar was effectively a corporate dictatorship run by Chairman Rose's massive conglomerate, making it an absolute nightmare for a fresh startup. Meanwhile, Paldea was far too tightly governed by Gita's watchful eye. If we wanted maximum chaos for minimum effort, we had to look elsewhere. I slammed a silver coin directly onto the sunny islands of Alola. Dad's eyes sparkled with instant understanding, while Matori looked like she had just swallowed a whole tomato berry. The absolute beauty of Alola was that it possessed zero league oversight. It was an untapped paradise running purely on coconut drinks and island trials. While local dreamers were practically begging our regional league to let them establish an official circuit, they kept getting turned down. My genius strategy was simple: quietly hijack the tropical underworld, install our own puppet ruler as their future league chairman, and gobble up the entire island chain from the inside out. Dad burst out laughing and started clapping, absolutely thrilled by my audacity. He handed me full command of the operation, eager to see his favorite heir cook up some real trouble. Naturally, I wasn't about to invade an entire archipelago single-handedly like a penniless hobo, so I immediately hit him up for a squad of muscle and management. When Dad tried to play hardball about keeping his top 4 lieutenants for local operations, I pulled my best guilt trip face. I demanded at least one high-level executive who actually knew how to run a proper invasion. After a bit of dramatic bartering, I snagged Lance and a handful of competent officers to serve as my personal enforcers. Satisfied with my brand new task force, I stood up with a triumphant smirk. The boring, amateurish journey was over, and it was time for the real game to begin. As a reborn mastermind, I wasn't about to waste my life playing small-time crook. I was going to swallow up those other delusional syndicates, assemble the ultimate rainbow squad, and build an empire that would make the world tremble. Dad tried to act all serious, warning me to keep my chaotic nature on a leash so I wouldn't accidentally set off the league's alarm bells. I gave him my most innocent, angelic smile, the kind that makes mothers hand over their cookie jars, and promised I would be an absolute saint. Then, to push my luck, I asked if I could kidnap his star secretary, Matori, to run my new regional office. The look on his face was pure gold, but he flatly refused. The very next day, I strutted into the bustling Goldenrod airport, ready to trade office politics for tropical beaches. Lance and Domino were waiting by the terminal, looking like a high-fashion villain duo. Lance, with his smooth green hair and brooding elite vibe, gave me a precise breakdown of my flight schedule down to the second. Right beside him was Domino, looking every bit the lethal secret agent disguised as a glamorous model. Dad might have been stingy by only giving me 2 top-tier henchmen instead of an army, but at least he picked high-grade middle management. I reminded them to drop the overly formal prince title while we were out in public and just stick to calling me young master. Satisfied with their enthusiastic response, we boarded the plane and took off toward the sunny paradise of Alola. Stepping off the jet at Mele Mele Island, the warm ocean breeze hit my face like a scented tropical towel. The endless blue horizon looked like a postcard, and the streets of Hawali City were buzzing with sun-soaked tourists. Naturally, my first executive command in this new land was to find a high-end restaurant, order a mountain of local seafood, and book a private dining room for our mastermind summit. Over a glass of fresh pineapple juice, Lance informed me that our first wave of grunt personnel had landed safely. I immediately told him to go on a real estate shopping spree. He needed to buy up prime land and snap up a massive commercial mall to convert into a signature entertainment hub. After all, conquerors can't live on ambition alone. Running a syndicate requires heavy cash flow, and turning arcades into profit machines was our corporate specialty. Next, I turned my attention to Domino, instructing her to deploy her spy network to scrape every bit of dirt on the local Ether Foundation and Team Skull. I wanted Team Skull prioritized as our first target. Since we were the new kids on the block, it was only polite to drop by and give our local villainous colleagues a proper, terrifying handshake. Lance raised an eyebrow, hesitantly suggesting that picking a fight with the local street mafia right off the plane might be a bit reckless. I laughed into my juice, completely brushing off his caution. I assured him that Team Skull was nothing more than a glorified club for whiny dropouts led by a sore loser. Once Domino tracked down their hideout, those tropical wannabes were going to be evicted from the island ecosystem for good. 2 days melted away in a flash, proving that Hawali City was absolute paradise for anyone looking to perfect the art of doing nothing. I was stretched out on a beach lounger like a satisfied Snorlax, sipping fresh coconut water through a straw and admiring the scenic coastal views. Out of nowhere, a random guy in tiny swim trunks and goggles popped into my personal space, flashing a blinding smile and asking for a seaside battle. I silently stared at him, letting a heavy, awkward pause stretch between us. Behind my lounger, my Jengar oozed out an ominous cloud of purple gas right on cue. The guy's smile instantly evaporated, and he executed a flawless panic apology before sprinting away like a startled Magikarp. I called off Jengar's shadow trick and reached for my delicious slice of strawberry cake, only to grab empty air. Looking down, I caught my rotund ghost red-handed with crumbs smeared all over its face, trying to play innocent. I threw my wallet at the little glutton and ordered it to float off and fetch me a fresh batch. A short distance down the shore, 2 girls were enjoying the ocean breeze. One was Lily, carrying a very special secret inside her oversized bag, and the other was Mizuki, an energetic trainer who had recently moved from Kanto. The same unlucky swimmer in trunks tried his luck with them next, offering a friendly battle. Mizuki eagerly accepted, but instantly demanded he wager his allowance, and then his trunks when he claimed to be broke, leaving the poor guy wondering what kind of local monsters he had offended. Today, while Mizuki was busy terrorizing the local beachgoers, Lily's curious little cosmic, affectionately nicknamed Nebby, slipped out of her bag and floated away into the bustling crowd. Lily panicked and gave chase, completely losing track of the cosmic little creature among the sea of tourists. Following its happy squeaks, Lily finally spotted Nebby resting comfortably right in my lap. I was sitting cross-legged in the shade, gently scratching the little nebula behind its ears while feeding it sweet candy. When Lily rushed up to apologize for the intrusion, I carefully handed the little guy back, reassuring her that it was no trouble at all. Nebby tried to wriggle its way back toward me, prompting Lily to marvel at how quickly her shy companion had taken to a total stranger. I chuckled, making a light joke about my natural charm with wild Pokémon, and offered her a piece of my newly purchased strawberry cake. Before she could politely decline, Mizuki's voice echoed across the sand as she searched for her friend. Recognizing her instantly, I offered Lily a warm goodbye and quietly slipped back into the crowd before my star-crossed acquaintance could spot me. Mizuki still had her own training path to walk, and I was more than patient enough to wait for our inevitable reunion. By the time Lily processed what had just happened, my mysterious back was already vanishing into the crowd like a shadowy phantom. She let out a small sigh over her lost manners, turned around, and flagged down her energetic friend. Mizuki jogged over like a winded yamper, gasping for air and demanding to know how her non-combatant pal had managed to wander off so far. Lily threw her little cosmic passenger right under the bus, leaving Mizuki to crouch down and start playfully interrogating the floating stardust ball. Nebby puffed its cheeks and glared, but Mizuki wasn't about to take lip from a creature that looked like a glorified nightlight. She put her hands on her hips, puffed out her chest like a grand villain, and casually threatened to cut off its candy supply. When the little creature let out a squeak, Mizuki declared it a brilliant, obedient student, completely ignoring the fact that it had actually just blown a raspberry at her. Lily could only offer a polite, helpless smile at her friend's terrifyingly delusional translation skills. Mizuki then pressed for details on how Lily had tracked down her runaway star. When Lily innocently mentioned a very gentle boy who had helped her, Mizuki's eyebrows practically shot into her hairline. Lily quickly flushed pink and insisted it wasn't a romantic secret encounter, though she secretly treasured how easily she had made a best friend in this paradise. Meanwhile, I was casually strolling toward my newly purchased beachfront mansion. 10 minutes away from the main sands sat a luxurious villa district, perfectly suited for a dark prince seeking a little peace and quiet. But as I passed a nearby training ground, a strikingly familiar figure caught my eye. 16 years of being reborn in this world had made my pop culture memory a bit hazy, but there was no mistaking that golden hair and royal aura. She was wearing a gorgeous white and pink dress that hugged her sleek silhouette, tied at her tiny waist with a pristine sash. It was Katlia, the Battle Castle Princess of Sinnoh and future Psychic Elite Four of Unova. She was essentially a ticking psychic time bomb wrapped in high fashion. Her power was so absurdly massive that throwing a temper tantrum during a loss could accidentally flatten a city block. Because of her emotional volatility, the League had effectively put her on combat probation, forcing her to let her butler do the heavy lifting while she learned self-control. She was also ridiculously rich, owning luxury villas across the globe like normal people own spare socks. Intrigued, I stopped to watch her try to teach her Curlia the move Psychic. She was taking the slow, traditional route by having her Pokémon blast a Metagross, which is about as effective as trying to learn advanced calculus by throw sponge balls at a brick wall. Predictably, her eyebrows began to twitch, and a glowing blue aura of psychic rage started leaking from her skin. She took a deep breath, suppressing her inner volcano, but the frustration was clear. I stepped forward, flashed a charming smile, and offered to act as her sparring partner, holding up a pokeball. I pointed out that hitting a punching bag could never match the high of a real brawl. She studied me with cold, aristocratic eyes, warning me that she would get dangerously angry if I proved to be a boring opponent. I promised her a battle she would never forget as my smile slowly morphed into a wicked, villainous grin. Right on cue, a dramatic cloud of purplish-black smoke billowed up around my shoulders, complete with an eerie, echoing laugh. Katlia's eyes widened, completely bewildered by the fact that I had suddenly transformed into an actual final boss. I snapped, glaring at the dark fog surrounding me, and told Jengar to cut out the theatrical nonsense. My chubby ghost popped its head out from my shadow, blinking its scarlet eyes in utter confusion, asking if I didn't appreciate the epic boss entrance special effects. My face twitched uncontrollably. I had no idea where the fat little ghost was sneaking off to watch vintage superhero cartoons, but its timing for dramatic flair was absolute comedy. After stomping Jengar back into my shadow, from which it dramatically emerged clutching a giant red bump on its head, I offered a smooth, polite apology to my noble opponent. Katlia tilted her head in absolute bewilderment, staring at the cartoonish lump on my surprisingly grayish-black ghost, likely wondering if all shiny Jengar were this absurdly theatrical. Suppressing her confusion, she extended a fair, delicate hand and accepted the match with the breathtaking elegance of a high-class heiress. We took our positions on the training field, exchanging brief pleasantries about her preference for psychic types. After casually tossing a pokeball, my Mismagius floated into the light, its hollow, doll-like body and glowing golden eyes casting a sinister chill across the turf. Katlia's instincts immediately sounded the alarm, recognizing the massive type disadvantage and the sheer, intimidating aura of my phantom. When I casually mentioned my mastery over the trifecta of villainy, ghost, evil, and poison, her brows twitched. It was a hilarious, unspoken prejudice, as those three types were practically the official trademark of every criminal syndicate in history. She wisely recalled her frail Curlia and deployed her heavy hitter, a magnificent, metallic Metagross. I granted her the first move, and she immediately ordered a high-speed bullet punch. As the giant steel beast lunged forward, I offered a calm, unbothered critique of her reckless aggression, leaving her seething in silence. Instead of dodging, my Mismagius absorbed the heavy blows with a chilling, pain-free smile, while summoning a ghostly blue will-o-wisp. The flames engulfed Metagross instantly, crippling its physical attack power with a severe burn. Katlia bit her lip, trying to stay composed by banking on her pseudo-legendary's high special attack. But I immediately shattered that hope by commanding a curse. My Mismagius cackled shrilly as a phantom nail slowly drove into its own chest, sacrificing its own health to layer a debilitating hex onto her already suffering iron giant. Watching my ghost take mad pleasure in the painful ritual gave the poor girl a total creep-out. With her prized Pokémon crippled by severe burns and trapped in a relentless curse, Catlia's composure completely snapped. Her skirt and golden hair began floating in midair without any wind, and a glowing blue psychic aura flared in her eyes like a dangerous storm. Realizing she was on the verge of a psychic meltdown, I didn't panic. Instead, I eagerly whipped out my phone to record the glorious show. I was genuinely curious to see if her unhinged superpower rage could top Sabrina's. My Mismagius slammed the final nail into Metagross's coffin, locking in a deadly gray curse that struck like lightning. The iron giant growled in agony as dark fumes began wafting off its metallic hide. Catlia was desperately trying to keep her cool, but her psychic energy was visibly leaking out like steam from a blown gasket. Her eyes flashed a terrifying iridescent blue as she tried to force out a psychic attack, but my ghost simply popped up a leafy green protect barrier, taking the hit like a champ. She then tried to close the gap with a bullet punch, but her crippled beast staggered midway, hit again by the tick-tock damage of the curse. Watching my phantom cackle like a cartoon villain at her suffering completely shattered Catlia's remaining sanity. She snapped, unleashing her raw, materialized psychic power to lock Mismagius in midair. When her poor Metagross tried to hover over and calm her down, she casually swiped her arm and telekinetically launched her own Pokémon across the yard. Watching this human disaster zone go full final boss mode, I chuckled to myself, realizing exactly why the league had benched her. She was basically a legendary Pokémon trapped in a high-fashion dress. Deciding we'd had enough theatrical melodrama, I signaled Gengar to creep out from her shadow and pop a sneaky hypnosis right under her nose. Within seconds, her glowing blue eyes went foggy, and she collapsed out cold. Gengar politely floated her onto a nearby park bench like a floating mattress service. While her frantic Metagross hovered over her, I unceremoniously rummaged around her waist to snatch its Pokeball, taking a mental note that her waist was impressively sleek. I recalled the metallic beast to wipe off the cursed debuff, released it back out, and reassured the overly protective guard dog that despite my dark charm, I wasn't a complete hooligan. When Metagross pointed out that its rich, gorgeous trainer was top-tier eye candy, I candidly agreed that I was a massive fan of her aesthetics. About 10 minutes later, the sleeping beauty finally stirred. She sat up, holding her throbbing head, and immediately panicked when she saw her giant metal turtle hovering anxiously over her. Recognizing me, she sank into a pool of familiar shame, lamenting that her uncontrollable powers made her a freaky outcast whom everyone feared and banned from official tournaments. I gave her a soothing green blast of Viridian energy to cure her headache, completely scoffing at her self-pity. I told her straight up that being an absolute freak of nature just meant she was one of God's favored children, and that the weak only whined because they were jealous of true power. Tears welled up in her eyes as she finally let out years of pent-up frustration about living in the shadow of her undefeated champion pal, Cynthia. I picked up her stylish pink hat, gently placed it back on her golden head, and reminded her that true nobility means staying impeccably elegant while slapping your doubters in the face. Blushing slightly at the close distance, she composed herself, introduced herself properly, and asked for my advice on whether she should keep chasing her unbeatable friend. I leaned in with a sinister grin, told her to embrace her inner ambition, and casually asked if she craved true, dark power. I left Catlia standing alone on the field with her Metagross, looking like a lone, delicate sculpture bathed in the afternoon sun. I had dropped my pitch, asking if she craved true power, and slipped a gleaming silver, our badge, into her palm. I told her that if she wanted to stop being a helpless, benched victim and truly show the world her perfection, she should embrace the dark side and give me a call. Left to her own devices, Catlia stared at the ornate Team Rocket emblem, utterly shocked that a charm offensive from a villainous syndicate prince was currently rewriting her life choices. Before she could overthink it, her phone buzzed with a call from Cynthia, the Sinnoh champion herself. Cynthia proudly announced that after endless bureaucratic nagging, the league had agreed to lift Catlia's combat ban in 2 weeks, provided she kept her temper in check. Instead of jumping for joy, my corrupting little speech began working its magic. Catlia realized how pathetic it was to celebrate being granted permission to do what should have been her basic right. She scoffed at the idea of spending another half-month acting like a dangerous circus animal under observation. She gave Cynthia a cold, elegant thank you, declared that the weak, self-doubting version of herself was officially dead, and promised to grow strong enough to shatter the world's expectations. Meanwhile, I was back at my villa, lounging on the plush sofa and feeling like an absolute strategic genius. Pushing a proud, repressed heiress off her moral high horse with a little custom psychological guidance was surprisingly easy. Domino strutted into the living room in her sleek business suit, offering a shoulder massage while inquiring about my mysterious good mood. I pulled her into my lap like a proper mafia boss and asked for an update on our local expansion. Domino reported that her intelligence unit had already pinned down Team Skull's hideout like a bug type on a corkboard. However, Lance's real estate venture was hitting a wall because the stubborn local developers were being ridiculously xenophobic, refusing to sell large plots of land even for inflated prices. I shrugged off the property hiccups for the time being, deciding that an old-fashioned villainous takeover was best solved in stages. I instructed Domino to tell Lance to pack a heavy squad for tomorrow morning, as we were going to pay our delightful new colleagues at Team Skull a proper house call. With business handled for the evening, I turned my full attention to my gorgeous spy, letting out a satisfied smirk as the sun dipped below the horizon. The next morning unfolded with a delightful surprise. I had originally planned to kick off my day with a little light morning cardio alongside Domino, but my phone rang with an early call from Katlia. The highborn psychic genius had tossed and turned all night, battling her inner demons, before finally deciding to take the plunge into our glorious underground empire. I welcomed her with open arms and a triumphant smile. Gaining an Elite 4-level prodigy like her was a massive win for Team Rocket, which desperately needed more heavy hitters at the very top. She looked into my eyes, shook my hand, and declared her commitment to witnessing the dark side of the world to speed up her growth. I gestured for her to take a seat, assuring her that she would never regret hopping onto my chaotic bandwagon. She slid gracefully onto the sofa, smoothing out her luxurious dress, and immediately asked why our rockets were setting up shop in Alola. I loved how quickly she adopted the team spirit. I poured her a cup of premium tea imported straight from Galar, explaining with a grin that our operations back home in Kanto were hitting a corporate ceiling, meaning it was time to forcefully expand our portfolio into new island territories. She blinked, genuinely fascinated by the concept of open territory grabbing, and noted that she had joined at a very dramatic time. I chuckled, confirming that today was our official day to pay a friendly, terrifying house call to the local Team Skull. To properly cement her loyalty, I pulled a shrunken Poke Ball out of my pocket and offered it to her as a welcome gift. When she tried to politely decline out of modesty, I played the friendship card, forcing her to accept it. She popped the ball open, releasing a tiny, adorable Hatenna right onto the tea table. I gave her a quick rundown of the little Galar native, highlighting that its future evolution was a psychic and fairy powerhouse known as the Forest Witch. More importantly, I pointed out its magic bounce ability, which cleanly reflects status moves right back at the attacker. A playful jab at how my Mismagius had cursed her Metagross the day before. Katlia beamed, scooping up the little psychic creature with pure delight, her heart completely melting over her new partner. Right on cue, the doorbell rang and Lance stepped into the room, bowing politely before his eyes landed on our gorgeous new recruit. I formally introduced Katlia as our newest senior executive, while jokingly introducing Lance to her as the only top-tier henchman I managed to squeeze out of my stingy father. Lance was internally stunned that I had managed to recruit a top-ranked powerhouse within days of landing on the island, silently marveling at my unmatched charisma. He offered her a warm, courteous greeting, and Katlia responded with a flawless, aristocratic curtsy. Lance instantly approved of his refined new colleague, privately celebrating the fact that she wasn't an annoying, arrogant brat like some of his fellow commanders back home. Ulula Island was the biggest piece of real estate in the Eastern Archipelago, guarded by a giant deity and ruled by a local king. Frankly, none of those fancy titles mattered to me. What actually mattered was the intelligence Domino had gathered, pinpointing Team Skull's grand headquarters right inside a walled settlement called Patown. I rolled into town with Katlia, Lance, and a pair of basic rocket grunts. Lance had been sweating bullets the entire trip, convinced that invading a rival syndicate's turf with a 5-person squad was a hilarious speed run toward getting crushed. I had tried telling him that even the 2 extra grunts were pure decorative padding, but he remained stubbornly skeptical. He had quietly resolved to play bodyguard and pull me out the moment fists started flying. The moment we stepped through the gates, Lance's grand anxiety instantly turned into pure, unadulterated shock. Patown looked like an absolute landfill with a property line. It was an abandoned, broken-down slum painted over with abstract, ugly graffiti, completely devoid of civilized life. Katlia, being a high-born heiress with a mild obsession with cleanliness, shuddered in physical disgust at the litter cluttering the pavement. Lance felt an overwhelming urge to apologize for overestimating our rivals, realizing that calling this place an evil syndicate's lair was a massive insult to actual crime lords. I chuckled, strolling toward the main mansion. I reminded them that when an entire squad is founded by a sore loser, you shouldn't expect a five-star resort. Team Skull was a tragic comedy. Their leader, Guzma, failed his local island trials, threw a massive temper tantrum, and built a club exclusively for fellow dropouts who took pleasure in breaking things. In my eyes, these self-destructive wannabes were giving villainy a bad name. We eventually arrived at a dilapidated mansion sitting at the northern edge of town. Before we could even admire the rod, a thin guy and a fat guy in black vests, face masks, and ridiculous skull-patterned bandanas jumped out from behind a bush to demand our credentials. I stared at their matching outfits, clicked my tongue, and openly mocked the atrocious fashion sense of whoever designed their gear. Katlia nodded in silent, aristocratic agreement. Enraged by my blunt critique, the heavier guy stepped forward, spraying spit as he threatened to duel me on the spot. Before he could finish his sentence, a massive purple arbok materialized out of nowhere and whipped its heavy tail directly into his chest with a sickening thud. The guy went flying into the dirt, crying like a baby over a broken arm. The skinny guy panicked, completely losing his mind as his buddy rolled around in the dust. Katlia blinked, quietly taking notes on how my upper management handled unsanctioned attitude. Lance stepped forward with an ice-cold glare, asking the trash on the floor who granted him permission to address his young master in such a tone. While Lance usually acted like a polite, smooth-talking gentleman, he was actually the most ruthless enforcer on my dad's payroll. When Lance motioned for his Cobra to finish the job, I raised a hand and casually called him off. I wasn't acting out of the goodness of my heart. I just knew those useless dropouts still had basic physical value. The decent ones could be re-educated into functional rocket minions, while the absolute deadweight could be shipped off to work the mines. Waste not, want not. I offered the two trembling teenagers a polite, dazzling smile, asking if they would be so kind as to inform their boss, Guzma, that Kanto's Team Rocket had arrived for a friendly house call. The skinny kid stared at me like I was an alien, completely traumatized by how casually my enforcer had snapped his buddy's arm over a little backtalk. Lance stepped up with a dark, menacing growl, asking if he needed to repeat the invitation. That was all the motivation they needed. The thin teenager grabbed his whimpering, broken partner and scrambled inside the mansion like two terrified Rattata. Katlia tilted her head, quickly piecing together my master plan. She asked if I was seriously attempting to absorb this entire circus of street thugs into our corporate empire. I gave her a suave nod, admitting that while these dropouts were basically human landfill, even garbage could be repurposed with a little proper management. We were running a tight crew in Alola, and swallowing Team Skull whole would instantly fill our low-level labor shortages. When she raised an eyebrow over what we would do if they stubbornly refused to surrender, I grinned, promising her that choice was a luxury they simply didn't possess. Deep inside the rundown mansion, the front doors burst open as the two grunts stumbled in, sobbing hysterically. Plumeria, the team's terrifying big sister and sole executive officer, instantly scowled from across the room. The fat kid threw himself at her feet, blubbering that some Kanto mobsters had shattered his limb, begging her to avenge him. Plumeria's eyes flared with icy fury. She was fiercely protective of her little flock of strays. She quickly ordered a couple of grunts to haul the heavy winner off to a hospital. Before she could process how an infamous Kanto syndicate had magically sprouted up on her tropical island, Lance decided to skip the polite knocking. A massive blast detonated the front gates into sawdust, sending a barrage of displaced Team Skull members flying backward into the foyer. 3 bruised grunts scrambled up to Plumeria, whimpering that a pack of monsters had steamrolled right through their front lawn. I strolled casually through the freshly pulverized doorway, brushing dust off my collar while offering a delightfully insincere apology. I sighed, gently scolding Lance for overdoing the dramatic entrance and ruining the property value. Plumeria's chest heaved with rage at my absolute arrogance. I flashed another friendly smile, promising that Team Rocket would happily reimburse them for the broken door and any minor medical bills. One of my quick-witted rocket grunts instantly darted into a corner, wiped off a dusty chair, and slid it directly behind me like a seasoned valet. I took a seat, crossed my legs, and looked entirely at home in their ruined living room. Lance flanked me with a cold, predatory gaze, while Katlia stood gracefully by my side, her stunning pink ball gown looking hilariously out of place amidst the moldy furniture and graffiti. Plumeria fumed, asking if this violent break-in was my definition of a polite visit. I waved a hand, treating the crushed gate as a harmless little icebreaker. I then politely asked if she would summon Mr. Guzma so we could have a nice, civilized chat. She lied through her teeth, claiming Guzma was out of town, though she admitted she was holding back her own explosive temper purely out of respect for Team Rocket's terrifying global reputation. Seeing right through her stall tactic, I decided to lay all my cards on the table. I grinned, scanning the angry crowd of local delinquents with pure, unadulterated malice. I casually announced that Team Rocket was expanding into Alola, but found their little street gang to be an annoying eyesore standing right in our path. Therefore, I asked with a beaming smile if they would kindly disband their little club and merge directly into Team Rocket. The entire mansion fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Plumeria's face turned completely pale with outrage, while Katlia stared at me in absolute shock, privately concluding that my level of shameless arrogance was practically a superpower in itself. The dead silence in the room stretched until Plumeria finally found her voice, asking in complete disbelief if I had truly just demanded their complete surrender. I crossed my legs comfortably, flashed a customer service smile, and happily repeated myself, just in case she thought her ears were playing tricks on her. Katlia quietly palmed a pokeball, bracing for the impending riot. My proposal was essentially the equivalent of taking a massive dump on their collective pride, and the local delinquents responded right on cue. The crowd exploded into a chaotic mess of curses and thrown pokeballs, eager to jump the arrogant teenager making a mockery of their gang. I winced at the deafening noise, casually calling on Katlia to quiet down the peanut gallery. She instantly obliged, her eyes glowing a brilliant cosmic blue as her massive, metallic Metagross materialized like a heavily armed tank. It unleashed a towering shockwave of raw telekinetic force that instantly blasted every single enemy Pokémon backward like bowling pins. With the room suddenly reduced to a stunned, shivering silence, I offered a polite, gentle reminder that I truly despised useless dogs who did nothing but bark. A few particularly stubborn strays tried to step forward and puff out their chests, so I politely authorized Katlia to leave them barely breathing, noting that local hospitals were great at reattaching limbs. When my psychic prodigy offered a sweet, agreeable nod, the brave volunteers took a synchronized step backward and swallowed hard. Plumeria finally snapped at her gang to stand down, turning her icy gaze back onto me. She tried to play the diplomatic card, claiming that while Team Rocket was terrifying, forcing a total merger was crossing the line in Alolan territory. She warned me that pushing for a mutually destructive showdown wouldn't end well for either side. I literally burst out laughing. I wheezed, clapped my hands, and congratulated her on having a surprisingly top-tier comedy routine. Once I caught my breath, I straightened up and scoffed at the absurd notion that her parade of local dropouts could ever force a stalemate against my corporate syndicate. I cut the polite act entirely, laying down the brutal truth. We weren't here to negotiate. We were delivering an eviction notice. Their options were simple: hand over the keys and join the brand, or watch us level their hideout to the ground. When the grunts tried to drown us out with another wave of angry shouting, Lance stepped forward with his massive purple Arbok hissing at his heels, coldly promising to slice out the next tongue that made a sound. The room instantly went as quiet as a graveyard. Losing her cool completely, Plumeria pointed out that there were only 5 of us standing in her living room against 27 of her crew, desperately convincing herself that math was on her side. I chuckled at her adorable logic, reminding her that stacked trash is still just a pile of garbage. With an Elite 4 powerhouse and my father's most ruthless executioner flanking me, 27 against 3 weren't odds in her favor. They were just a target-rich environment. Just as the room reached a boiling point, a raspy voice echoed down the staircase, demanding to know who was calling his crew a bunch of nobodies. The grunts practically wept with relief as Guzma stepped into the room, rocking his signature white hair, forehead sunglasses, and a swagger that practically screamed unresolved childhood issues. He strolled over with his hands jammed in his baggy pants, leaning in close to puff out his chest, and order me to scurry back to Kanto so he could finish his afternoon nap. I clicked my tongue, utterly unimpressed by his tough guy routine, and openly mocked him for running a glorified daycare center instead of a proper villainous syndicate. Enraged, Guzma sneered that I had come to the wrong neighborhood to get beaten up, throwing out a massive, heavily armored Golisopod. The overgrown bug roared, radiating the kind of serious physical threat that made Katlia touse her brows in genuine concern. I smirked, stepping past my bodyguards to handle this little pest control problem myself. I flicked a pokeball off my fingertip, unleashing Annihilate. The gray rage monkey landed silently, staring down the armored beast with blood-red eyes that promised absolute violence. Guzma smirked, ordering his bug to execute a high-speed first impression. The giant armored warrior launched forward like a cannonball, but my Annihilate simply primed a glowing blue focus punch and swung. The collision detonated with a deafening boom, but in a fraction of a second, my monkey's sheer force shattered the attack, sending Golisopod flying backward through the air like a discarded chew toy, until it slammed straight through the drywall. The entire mansion went dead quiet. Plumeria's jaw hit the floor, while Katlia's eyes sparkled with sheer admiration for my monster's horrifying strength. I chuckled, reminding the dazed crowd that big fish in tiny Alolan ponds usually drown when they step into the deep ocean. Guzma's wild beast demeanor completely cracked. He panted heavily and demanded to know who the hell I really was. I offered my name with a polite bow, asking if he was finally ready for a grown-up conversation. Knowing he had just been thoroughly outclassed, Guzma swallowed his pride and grunted for me to follow him upstairs. He called Plumeria along, leaving his traumatized grunts downstairs to ponder their bleak career prospects. He led us into a second-floor office that looked like a hurricane had hit a landfill, calmly gesturing for us to make ourselves at home on a few dusty wooden crates. Lance swiftly prepped a clean stool for me, while I openly judged the lack of hospitality. Getting straight to business, I reiterated that Team Rocket was taking over Alola, and absorbing Team Skull was a non-negotiable step. But because I am fundamentally a generous boss, I pulled out 2 silver, our badges, and tossed them over. I offered both Guzma and Plumeria immediate senior executive positions in my new world order, watching with pure amusement as they stared at the shiny silver emblems sitting in their palms. Stepping into a high-ranking corporate executive suit at Team Rocket was a career upgrade Plumeria had certainly never put on her resume. Lance shot both of them a skeptical side-eye, silently calculating whether they had enough corporate polish to deserve the shiny new title. While Lance had his doubts about her battle prowess, I knew Plumeria was a hidden HR gem. Managing a daycare full of unhinged, graffiti-spraying dropouts required an elite level of middle management talent, and she had kept that chaotic circus running like clockwork. Plumeria broke the silence, voicing her deep suspicion that trading their local gang status for a Team Rocket membership was just signing up for a permanent spot on the league's most wanted list. I literally chuckled out loud at her logic, politely pointing out the hilarious irony of her moral high ground. While her little squad was busy stealing stray lunchboxes and terrorizing tourists, Team Rocket was operating clean, legitimate breeding farms, and building a proper shadow empire. I warned her that the moment an official Alola League opened its doors, her local street crew would be the very first pest problem swept into a jail cell. I leaned back, painting a grand picture of what real corporate villainy looked like. I offered them both high-paying administrative seats in our new Alolan branch, promising they could keep managing their loyal flock, provided they swapped their rundown slum for a real career. After a long, dramatic silence that felt like waiting for a slow elevator, Guzma finally snapped, shouting that he was in. He didn't care about standard temptations like money or fame. He was starving for validation, desperate to show the elite snobs who rejected him that he could rule the underworld. I clapped my hands in absolute delight, offering him the title of Supreme King of the Dark World. Guzma flashed a wicked, razor-sharp smile, thoroughly sold on the pitch. When I turned to Plumeria, she hesitated, offering her surrender on one condition, that I wouldn't purge or harm any of the low-level grunts who refused to sign the contract. I stood up and graciously shook both their hands, happily granting her mercy. I had originally planned to send any non-compliant deadweight off to work the assembly lines, but letting a few go was a small price to pay for securing 2 regional bosses. Lance and Katlia welcomed our new colleagues into the fold. Lance was thrilled to finally offload some of his ridiculous workload, while Katlia stood there quietly fascinated by how fast a armed robbery could turn into a cozy corporate team building exercise. I instructed Guzma and Plumeria to head downstairs and break the news to the grunts, making it clear that joining was strictly opt-in with full benefits. To kickstart our rebranding, I told Plumeria to grab a bag of cash from Lance and buy up a couple of local textile factories immediately. I made no secret of my total disgust for their tacky skull bandanas and baggy pants, ordering them to design proper, sleek uniforms that didn't look like a discount Halloween costume. Katlia fought for her life to keep a straight face as both Guzma and Plumeria stood there in stunned, speechless embarrassment over my savage fashion critique. Before Guzma could process the wardrobe makeover, I handed him the keys to our upcoming casino and entertainment complex, appointing him as the grand frontman. Guzma pointed at his own chest in absolute disbelief, entirely floored by the hilarious mental image of a notorious street fighter running a high-end gambling establishment. I gave Guzma a deadpan look, utterly baffled by his total sudden onset panic. He rubbed his neck in sheer distress, confessing that he was just a glorified street delinquent who had zero clue how to manage a legitimate entertainment business. Lance chimed in to clarify that as a premier dark syndicate, running profitable commercial operations was actually our bread and butter. I let out a heavy sigh, trying to explain the basic economics of crime to a man whose financial strategy began and ended with stealing lunch money. When I asked if Team Skull actually paid their grunts a regular monthly salary, Guzma and Plumeria exchanged a deeply embarrassed, silent glance that said everything. I nearly choked on my tea. Running an empire took serious cash for payroll, bases, and bribing league officials. While Guzma's brain short-circuited over basic accounting, Lance reassured him that our Kanto headquarters would cover the initial startup capital, but our new Alolan casino needed to open fast too. Bring in the big bucks. Katlia sweetly chimed in, noting that Guzma's notorious street rep would draw massive crowds. Plumeria worried that his reputation was 99% negative, but I brushed it off, promising to spin a fake sentimental sob story in the local news to turn his infamy into viral marketing. I assured Guzma he just needed to be a handsome figurehead while professional managers ran the floor, which instantly relieved his stress. I then sent Plumeria off to buy up those clothing factories and recruit fresh blood, officially wrapping up our acquisition of Team Skull without dropping a single sweat. With the local gangs safely absorbed into our corporate folder, I set my sights on wiping out the regional Pokémon hunter organization. Unlike standard syndicate work, those greedy mercenaries treated Pokémon as pure disposable trade goods. Under my influence and my dad's silent approval, Team Rocket had moved away from barbaric poaching and unethical human testing. I refused to run a business of mindless beasts. Even villains need basic standards. I turned to Katlia and happily handed her the task of exterminating the local hunter network, knowing it would be a stellar workout for her ascension to champion-level status. She accepted with an elegant smile, unfazed by the prospect of crushing black market poachers. I teased her about swapping her spotless pink ball gown for a sleek custom rocket uniform so she wouldn't get dirt on her lace, sending her into a deep, creative daydream about designing her new, villainous wardrobe. To top it off, I suggested she use Lance as a personal punching bag for combat practice whenever she was bored. Lance shot me a soul-crushing look of absolute betrayal. He was already working 24-hour shifts trying to keep my island takeover afloat, and the thought of being squeezed into double duty as a high-society sparring dummy had him desperately longing for his peaceful days back in Kanto, where his biggest daily challenge was picking out strawberry shortcakes. Patown was officially cleared of its resident gang as Team Skull dissolved overnight. With Guzma and Plumeria leading the mass exodus into our corporate embrace, most of the grunts happily signed their new rocket contracts, while the tiny handful of refusers quietly slunk away. Our regional expansion exploded into full gear. Domino played Master Spymaster, while Katlia swept through Melemele Island like a glamorous hurricane, completely obliterating every underground hunter base she could find and handing the keys right over to me. Plumeria scooped up a string of local textile factories, and Lance spent his days drowning in land acquisition paperwork. The poor guy was so overworked that he spent his nights secretly calling Apollo back in Kanto, sobbing into his pillow about how much he missed his old life. Meanwhile, our fake news campaign hit the island streets like absolute wildfire. Newspaper boys practically sprinted through every alleyway shouting about the tragic, heart-wrenching romance of Guzma's youth, claiming his deceased first love's parents had inspired him to turn his life around and open a high-end casino. Over in his research lab, Professor Kukui nearly choked on his morning coffee upon reading that his old, angry rival had suddenly become a reformed entertainment tycoon. He and Island King Hala couldn't figure out where Guzma had magically spawned a fortune, leaving Kukui suspecting that something deeply fishy was going on. Down on a private beach, Katlia was busy putting her freshly evolved Galade through its paces against Guzma's Sizer. The poor sword-wielding warrior took a loss, but its rapid improvement had Guzma grinning in total awe. I had personally stepped in a few days prior to insist her male Curlio evolve into a Galade rather than a Gardevoir, purely because a male Gardevoir was a crime against aesthetics that my delicate I simply couldn't endure. Katlia had taken my advice, used a Dawn Stone, and was now happily using Guzma and Lance as her personal punching bags to sharpen her battle instincts. I was lounging nearby on a plush beach chair, sipping fresh coconut water and soaking up the tropical rays like a proper syndicate prince. The sun, the waves, the total luxury, this was the life. The only thing missing was a gorgeous woman fanning me, but my sweet Domino was still fast asleep back at the villa, thoroughly exhausted from our extremely intense late-night combat practice. My phone suddenly buzzed with a call from Plumeria, who sounded oddly hesitant. She reported that a mysterious new walk-in had just strutted up to our recruiting desk, demanding an express membership into Team Rocket. When I lazily asked why she was bothering me over a single walk-in, she revealed the teenager introduced himself as Gladion. I raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of my coconut. Well, looks like my future brother-in-law had just dropped right into my lap. Gladion was the runaway prince of the Ether Foundation, escaping that floating paradise with type. Null, while his mother, Luzaman, turned their family dynamic into a nightmare of toxic control. While he used to freelance for Team Skull in another life, seeing him march right up to Team Rocket's recruitment desk in this reality was a glorious twist. Intrigued by this brooding, blonde-haired runaway, I decided to personally handle his corporate job interview. Half an hour later, I strutted into the office where Gladion stood waiting with his razor-sharp gaze and cold, brooding aesthetic. Plumeria instantly bowed, calling me young master, a title that made Gladion's brows twitch as he sizing me up. Taking Plumeria's seat, I crossed my legs and asked what brought the heir of Ether to my humble syndicate's doorstep. When he tried to play the cool, silent type by asking if he even needed a reason, I scoffed. I pointed out that everyone needs a motive, whether it's greed, desperation, or escaping a terrifyingly unhinged mother. His face darkened, but he gritted his teeth and tried to disown his family name, claiming he was just Gladion now. When he questioned if Team Rocket was secretly sweating over his mom's corporate wrath, I burst out laughing. The idea of fearing a regional research group without a single champion-level powerhouse to their name was pure comedy. If I truly felt like it, I could have an Elite Four heavy hitter sink their floating island base before dinner. Cornered, Gladion's hands clenched into tight fists as he battled his inner demons. Thinking of his sweet sister and his nightmare of a mother, he finally looked up with burning eyes and declared that he wanted to grow strong enough to break his chains. I grinned, standing up to shake his hand and welcoming him into our ranks. Recognizing his massive potential and his unique synthetic legend, I knew he'd be a crown jewel in our organization once trained properly. He set a firm personal boundary, declaring that he refused to steal stray Pokémon from innocent strangers. I waved my hand dismissively, assuring him that our high-class enterprise had long outgrown such petty street-level crime. I assigned him to report under Plumeria, tasked with hunting down the regional poacher networks across the remaining islands as a baptism by fire to earn his corporate stripes. I clapped him on the shoulder, promising that enough merit points could trade for top-tier pseudo-legendary hatchlings from our elite breeding facilities. To give him a taste of true executive motivation, I pulled out a tablet and pulled up our official Team Rocket Rewards app. Gladion stared at the glowing screen in absolute shock, visibly floored that a world-renowned criminal empire was operating like a modern tech startup with its own sleek mobile application. I caught the bewildered look on Gladion's face and playfully raised an eyebrow, pointing out that his shock was mildly insulting to my corporate pride. I proudly explained that my custom mobile platform was developed by a genius researcher I had personally hired, bringing our criminal enterprise straight into the modern digital age. I casually bragged about my plans to add group chats and video conferencing so our high-ranking executives could attend virtual board meetings without ever leaving their beach chairs. I patted his shoulder with a warm chuckle, assuring him that if he played his cards right, he'd be climbing the corporate ladder in no time. Gladion just stood there in utterly stunned silence, clearly experiencing an existential crisis as he realized joining a dark syndicate felt suspiciously like starting an entry-level desk job. To sweeten the deal, I scrolled down to the bottom of the digital rewards catalog to show him our premier employee perks. Gladion's eyes practically turned into dinner plates as he scanned the listings for elite pseudo-legendaries like Dratini, Larvitar, and Jangmo-O, all sitting at 50,000 merit points. But when his eyes landed on the grand prize at the very bottom, a mythical Phi-1 listed for 100,000 points, he completely lost his cool. He gasped in disbelief, asking if a literal mythical Pokémon could actually be claimed as a standard work bonus. I reassured him with a smug grin, remembering how I had casually snatched that little Phi-1 while sunbathing during a hot spring trip in Kanto. Sure, It was essentially the sea-dwelling equivalent of a common peasant compared to its royal parent Manaphy, and its battle stats were technically weaker than a standard starter. But dangling a genuine mythical Pokémon at the top of the corporate point ladder was the ultimate motivational carrot. It was the ultimate incentive to trick my employees into grinding overtime like their lives depended on it. Seeing Gladion's eyes burn with absolute, unhinged motivation, I secretly worried he might actually fall for the bait. I quickly reminded him that even bigger legendary targets would be added to the employee store soon, privately thinking that trading a grand prize like Moltres would feel far less like false advertising than handing over a glorified sea slug. Completely hooked by the dream of becoming an unstoppable hero to protect his sister, Gladion saluted me with deadly seriousness, promising to give his absolute all for the organization. Pleased with my new recruit's sudden burst of corporate loyalty, I instructed Plumeria to take him straight to Akala Island, so he could start smashing hunter bases to earn his first paycheck. Watching them head out to work, I stretched comfortably and headed back toward the beach, thoroughly satisfied with how my Alolan branch was thriving. Opening day for our Grand Alpaca Entertainment City arrived in the blink of an eye. Guzma had been poured into a sleek formal suit for the occasion, though he looked about as comfortable as a Tyranitar forced into a silk tutu. Even in top-tier tailoring, his ferocious face and unhinged villainous aura radiated pure, unfiltered menace. Some things, it seems, simply cannot be washed away by a dry cleaner. Thanks to a massive flood of bribed media reports hyping up Guzma's wild career pivot, the entire street was packed like a sardine can. I leaned against a nearby pillar, sipping my drink and wondering how many of these curious onlookers would leave our brand-new casino, crying with empty wallets. Watching the giant golden ribbon fall, Guzma grinned like a toddler who had just been handed the keys to a candy store, completely dazzled by how effortless grand openings appeared to be. He stood before the flashing cameras, loudly boasting to the crowd that our venue was the single most thrilling place on the planet. He took special delight in shooting smug, victorious glares at his former mentor, Hala, and his old rival, Professor Kukui. Both of them stood at the back of the crowd, looking like they had just swallowed a live wishiwashi. Guzma was practically floating on cloud nine, reveling in the glorious realization that he was finally forcing the region to look up to him. Then, a brave, suicidal journalist decided to crash the party. The reporter raised a microphone, bluntly asking why a notorious street thug had suddenly opened a luxury gambling complex, and insinuated the whole thing was funded by stolen gang money. Guzma's smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a dark, murderous glare that made the poor reporter swallow hard and question every single life choice that brought him to work that morning. Rather than cracking under pressure, Guzma simply activated his pre-packaged public relations pitch. He grunted that Team Skull was ancient history, insisting a wealthy friend had gifted him the startup capital. When the persistent reporter reminded him that they had personally met 6 months ago, specifically when Guzma unprovokedly knocked 2 of his teeth out, Guzma's brain did a brief hardware reset. Faced with historical facts, Guzma simply chose to rewrite reality. He executed a sharp, dramatic hand gesture and bellowed at the top of his lungs that he had been a sweet, law-abiding angel since the day he was born. Declaring the victimized reporter a paid actor spreading malicious lies, Guzma snapped his fingers. 2 massive, brick-house security guards instantly materialized, grabbed the screaming journalist by his collar, and dragged him away like a sack of laundry. The surrounding reporters suddenly found their throats very dry, instantly losing all desire to ask follow-up questions. Watching the hilarious circus unfold from the sidelines, Katlia gently adjusted her elegant white sun hat and tactfully whispered that Guzma might lack the delicate touch required for long-term corporate management. I chuckled, reassuring her that once the initial hype died down, a team of actual professionals would handle the books while Guzma remained our terrifying poster boy. We strolled away from the noise, and I asked Katlia how she was enjoying her new life as an elite syndicate officer. She beamed, admitting that her days were delightfully packed. Her morning routine consisted of steamrolling underground poacher bases, followed by brutal afternoon sparring sessions with Lance, Guzma, or myself. She quietly confessed that while losing 10 battles to Lance never bothered her, fighting my personal squad made her psychic powers flare up out of pure, unadulterated frustration. I simply smiled, reminding her that pushing her to the absolute brink of a mental breakdown was just my loving way of building her psychological resilience. Katlia beamed as we strolled down the sidewalk, boasting that her newly evolved Galade was rapidly shaping up to be one of her heavy hitters. Seeing how thrilled she was with her team's progress, I casually asked if her current battle roster had any open slots left. She shook her head, explaining that she was currently holding 5 Pokémon: her Metagross, Alakazam, Gothitelle, Galade, and the Hatenna I had gifted her. I suggested that her psychic squad could desperately use an NDD to automatically drop a psychic terrain the moment it stepped onto the field, pointing out that setting up the battlefield was just good tactical common sense. When she asked why I singled out a simple domestic servant over other options, I chuckled and teased that the only other creature alive with the psychic surge ability was a bit out of her weight class. For now, I revealed that the other option was none other than Tapu Lele, the legendary pink deity floating around Akala Island. Katlia raised an eyebrow, noting that even if she grew strong enough to box a literal god into a pokeball, the local Alolan government would completely lose its collective mind. Island kahunas treated those floating deities like holy relics, and poaching their local guardian spirit would spark an absolute diplomatic catastrophe. I scoffed at her worry, pointing out that as far as international league law was concerned, a wild creature in the woods is public property regardless of its religious status. I joked that if local officials tried to sue us for catching a deity, we would gladly drag them into a league courtroom and watch their faces fall. I assured Katlia that once she was strong enough to tame the pink menace, I would personally escort her to Akala Island, and any local politician who threw a temper tantrum over it could take it up with our enforcers. Katlia covered her mouth and giggled, thoroughly amused by my completely unhinged legal reasoning. Meanwhile, back inside the newly opened entertainment venue, Guzma was sitting in his break room rubbing his cheeks, complaining that his jaw muscles were cramping from forcing a fake customer service. Smile all morning. Before he could massage his face in peace, Professor Kukui crept up behind him and called his name, scaring him so badly he nearly kicked his old rival through a window. Guzma unleashed a barrage of colorful profanities, telling Kukui to take his hands off his expensive custom suit before things got bloody. Kukui held his ground, desperately trying to ask where Guzma had suddenly gotten the astronomical funding to build a gambling empire overnight. Refusing to spill any corporate secrets, Guzma simply bellowed for security to throw the trespasser out, prompting Kukui to make a hasty exit. Guzma slammed his office door and ordered his guards to erect a sign outside explicitly banning Kukui and stray dogs from the premises. Still fuming over his rival's nosy investigation, Guzma pulled out his phone to report the incident directly to me. But before he could dial my number, his screen lit up with an incoming call from Luzaman, the president of the Ether Foundation herself. Inside our seaside villa, I slowly swirled a glass of deep red wine, watching the sunset with a knowing smile while Guzma reported that Luzaman wanted an urgent face-to-face meeting. Katlia raised an eyebrow in genuine confusion, wondering why the saintly president of a famous charity foundation would reach out to a ruthless criminal syndicate. Guzma shifted uncomfortably, confessing that he used to do off-the-books dirty work for her back in his gang days. Sensing that her spotless public image was a total farce, he quickly pledged his undying loyalty to Team Rocket, terrified I might think he was playing double agent. I chuckled, assuring my reformed gang leader that everyone has a colorful past, and told him to book the dinner reservation immediately. 2 days flew by in a blur of massive profit. As expected, our new casino arcade was turning money like a well-oiled printing press, drawing wild crowds from every island in the archipelago. Dangling baby Dratini, Larvitar, and rare EV at the prize counter was pure psychological warfare, turning hordes of hopeful locals into absolute gambling addicts overnight. By the time the weekend rolled around, I found myself sitting in a private hotel suite, scanning the gorgeous woman seated across from me. Luzaman looked like $1,000,000 wrapped in a tailored platinum dress, exuding the effortless grace of a CEO who spent her weekends running a shadowy empire. Seeing her in person, Katlia was utterly fascinated by how a 40-year-old mother of 2 could possess the flawless, radiant skin of a 20-year-old supermodel. To the clueless citizens of Alola, Luzaman was a saintly, golden-hearted protector of injured Pokémon. But behind closed doors, her husband's disappearance into an ultra wormhole had turned her maternal love into a twisted obsession to hoard every rare creature in the universe. Her suffocating madness was precisely why her teenage kids, Gladion and Lily, had stolen her experimental secret projects and run away for dear life. I offered a polite greeting, making absolutely no effort to hide my appreciative gaze. She offered a subtle, annoyed twitch of her eyebrow at my bold scrutiny, but quickly swallowed her pride to state her business. She calmly asked if Team Rocket would accept a lucrative commission to track down and retrieve 2 specific runaways, sliding a glossy photograph across the table. Picking up the picture, I found myself staring right into the eyes of young Lily and my brand new junior executive recruit, Gladion. In another timeline, she would have hired Team Skull for this exact kidnapping job, but since I had bought out her usual contractors, she was forced to hire the big leagues. I gently ran my fingers over Lily's picture, looked Luzman dead in the eyes, and flashed a razor-sharp, mocking smile, teasing her that hunting down her own children didn't look particularly great. On her corporate resume, Luzman tried to play it cool, brushing off my hesitation by claiming that tracking down 2 teenagers shouldn't be a sweat for a major syndicate. I just offered a lazy, polite smile, explaining that our local expansion was burning through our manpower so fast that we barely had enough grunts to guard our own front desk, let alone act as her personal missing persons agency. I leaned back and dryly suggested she hire a private investigator instead, knowing full well that an official detective wouldn't do her twisted, dirty work. She stared at me like she wanted to incinerate me on the spot, insisting that these 2 runaways were vital to her interests and promising a massive payday if we delivered. Seeing her take the bait, I gave Katlia a subtle nod. My sharp psychic officer immediately produced a stack of legal documents Lance had been sweating over for weeks, a comprehensive list of prime Alolan real estate that xenophobic local owners refused to sell to us. Luzman scanned the papers, her eyes turning dangerously cold as she realized we were asking her to use the Ether Foundation's squeaky clean reputation as a front to buy up property for Team Rocket. She hissed that if the public ever discovered her charity colluding with a criminal empire, her saintly persona would instantly shatter. I casually shrugged, assuring her that we could take it as slow as she wanted, but making it crystal clear that without those land deeds, my grunts wouldn't even tie their shoes to help her. Driven mad by her obsession to recover the cosmic Pokémon her daughter had stolen, her pupils suddenly lost their highlights, going completely dead and empty, her signature physiological tick whenever. Her unhinged paranoia completely hijacked her brain. Chillingly detached, she gritted her teeth and agreed to our extortionate terms before sweeping out of the room like an angry storm cloud. Watching her leave, I swirled my wine glass, thoroughly amused by how ridiculously easy it was to manipulate someone with an all-consuming weakness. Katlia picked up the photo of Lily and Gladion, instantly connecting the dots and pointing out that Gladion was currently earning employee points in our low-level grunt department. She flashed a rare, playful smile and teased that I was a total villainous liar for taking Luzman's real estate without intending to hand her son back anytime soon. I chuckled, explaining that bringing Gladion out now would be useless while his mother was fully possessed by alien obsession, but holding both kids meant we held all the leash we needed to eventually swallow the Ether Foundation whole. Lost in my grand plan to eventually force Luzman into submission, I accidentally muttered aloud about the hilarious family dynamics if Lily called me her syndicate superior while her mom called me boss. Katlia tilted her head in utter confusion, asking what I had just whispered under my breath, prompting me to quickly clear my throat and lie that I was simply contemplating corporate strategy. The tropical paradise of Alola completely lacks standard Pokémon gyms, relying instead on an ancient, mystical tradition known as the Island Tour. Challengers wander across the 4 main islands, completing quirky trials hosted by local captains before facing the designated Island Kahuna in a grand final exam. Naturally, these kahunas pull their punches just enough so energetic rookie kids don't end up scarred for life. Over in Iki Town, a sacred village traditionally dedicated to honoring local guardian spirits, a massive crowd had gathered around the central festival stage. The entire town was buzzing with electric energy because a promising young trainer had finally stepped up to challenge Hala, the grand white-bearded kahuna of Mele Mele Island. Standing proudly on the wooden platform in his signature yellow coat, the veteran master faced a beaming girl named Celine, who casually adjusted her favorite flower-covered straw hat and flashed a fiery, confident grin. Celine wasn't just some ordinary wide-eyed rookie who had picked up a starter yesterday. She was a total tactical monster who had recently moved from Kanto. Watching her Dratini elegantly dismantle Hala's bulky Makahita on the stage, Professor Kukui crossed his arms and sighed in awe, openly admitting that her battle instincts made his own youthful talents look like absolute child's play. Standing beside him, young Lily cheered with a radiant smile, completely agreeing that this prodigy was destined to put Alola on the global map. Amidst the roaring cheers of the crowd, Lily suddenly felt her oversized travel bag twitch as her secret cosmic passenger, Little Nebby, squeezed its way out. The curious little space cloud immediately caught a whiff of something intriguing and drifted mindlessly into the packed sea of spectators. Panicking over the thought of her glowing alien companion getting captured by an eager tourist, Lily squeezed through the dense crowd, desperately scanning the area until she completely lost sight of it. Following her usual routine, she ducked away from the noise and headed toward a quiet tree nearby, only to freeze dead in her tracks. Drenched in soft afternoon sunlight filtering through the leaves, I was leaning casually against the tree trunk like a high-fashion model who had lost his way to a photo shoot. Held delicate in my fingers was a piece of sweet pink candy, which I was casually feeding to the floating cosmic cloud in front of me. The surrounding noise of the festival completely melted away as Lily stood there staring at us, totally dazed by the impossibly picturesque scene. Noticing the lovely blonde girl hovering nearby, I straightened up and offered a warm, charming greeting, amused by her flustered expression. Nebby let out a needy little soft noise, floating directly back into my face to demand another snack, so I cheerfully pinched its squishy cheeks and slipped it another treat. Teasingly asking if she had already forgotten the handsome stranger who helped her last time, I watched a bright, adorable blush instantly spread across her face as she stammered out an embarrassed apology. I chuckled softly, reassuring her that running into her and her energetic little space star at a local festival was a delightfully pleasant coincidence. Looking at how aggressively the celestial creature was cuddling against my hands, Lily offered a sweet, marveling smile, remembering my previous claim that my natural aura acted like absolute catnip for wild Pokémon. I let Nebby play in my hands for a few more seconds before carefully depositing the glowing little jelly bean back into Lily's arms. Teasingly reminding her that this was already the second time her cosmic roommate had staged a daring escape on my watch, I watched a bright, delicious crimson blush spread all the way to her ears. The poor girl looked like she was seconds away from evolving into a whistling tea kettle. Flashing a blindingly direct, flirtatious compliment about how adorable she looked when flustered, I casually waved goodbye and melted back into the alleyways, leaving her wide-eyed, completely speechless, and desperately wishing she had managed to ask for my phone number. As I strolled out of Iki Town, a sharp yellow streak of lightning suddenly zipped across the afternoon sky like an electric missile. It was Tapu Koko, the legendary guardian deity of Mele Mele Island, making a dramatic aerial exit. Gazing up at the yellow rooster-looking god, a brilliant light bulb clicked inside my head. It occurred to me that I had an empty roster slot just begging to be filled by a local divine mascot. Reviewing the legendary roster in my mind, my picky aesthetic standards immediately eliminated Tapu Koko and Tapu Bulu. Koko looked like a feathered wrestling mask, while Bulu was an oddly proportioned wooden bull that looked like it had been designed by a modern art student who lost their ruler. While their battle stats were admittedly impressive, I refused to walk around with a legendary that hurt my eyes. Tapu Lele was already reserved for Catlia's future psychic team, which left the sleek, majestic Tapu Fini of Pony Island as my prime target. Pulling out my phone, I dialed Guzma and ordered him to deploy our island network to track Tapu Fini's whereabouts, instructing him to alert me the moment it wandered into the wild alone. Guzma practically gagged on the phone, cackling with unholy glee as he realized that snagging Pony Island's sacred deity would completely throw the region's traditional government into an existential crisis. The local kahuna position had been vacant for years, and poaching their local deity meant the island would literally never have a legitimate leader ever again. Amused by his villainous enthusiasm, I casually added Tapu Bulu to the hunt list as an afterthought. Sure, it was an abstract wooden disaster, but a legendary is still a legendary. Stuffing it into our corporate app store as a high-tier employee reward would make my grunts work overtime until they collapsed. Hanging up the phone with a satisfied smirk, I set a lazy pace back toward the villa. I silently sent a word of thanks to that electric chicken in the sky for giving me such a wonderful idea, already shifting my mental priorities to convincing my lovely Domino to try on a custom-made outfit for tonight's off-duty briefing.